I'm delighted. There we go. I'm delighted to welcome our speaker and discussant today. We have with us Dr. Yesenia Barragan, who is Assistant Professor of History at Rutgers University. She's a historian of modern Latin America and the Caribbean, who works on transnational histories of race, slavery, and emancipation in Afro-Latin America and the African diaspora in the Americas. In 2014, Yesenia published Selling Our Death Masks, Cash for Gold in the Age of Austerity, which is an extraordinary book, I think won great praise, and I very much concur with Paul Bewley's assessment of it, which is read, cry, and learn. This year, Yesenia published Freedom's Captives, Slavery and Gradual Emancipation in the Colombian Black Pacific with Cambridge University Press, and it is this new book which is the subject of discussion today. Our discussant will be Dr. Bethan Fisk, who is a lecturer in colonial Latin American history and Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at the University of Bristol. Earlier this year, she published Black Knowledge on the Move, African Diasporic Healing in Caribbean and Pacific New Granada in the Atlantic Studies Journal. So I'll hand over now to Yesenia. Welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the introduction, Bill. Hold on, I'm going to share screen so I can show my PowerPoint. 1 second. Let me start. Okay, everyone, good afternoon. As you all know, my name is Yesenia Barragan. It's great to be here at UCL and the IHR Latin American History Seminar. Thank you once again to Bill Booth, Tom Rath, and everyone who made the seminar possible. And I really look forward to my dear colleague Bethan Fisk's later remarks. So a little bit about me. I'm a historian of Afro-Latin America and the African diaspora in the Americas. I focus especially on the histories of race, slavery, emancipation, and social movements in the 19th and 20th centuries. Now, my recently published book, which I'll be talking about today, is titled Freedom's Captives, Slavery and Gradual Emancipation on the Colombian Black Pacific. And this book is a narrative-driven social, political, and geographical study of the gradual abolition of slavery in Colombia, focusing especially on the Pacific lowlands of Colombia, which was the gold mining center of the former Spanish Empire and the largest area in the Americas inhabited primarily by people of African descent. The study begins in 1821 when a gradual emancipation law was enacted in Colombia, and then examines the immediate post-emancipation period beginning in 1852 when slavery was finally abolished. So here are the table of contents so you get a sense of the project as a whole. Today, I'll be talking mostly about chapters 3 and 4, which focus on the political project of gradual emancipation and the children of the free womb. But I'm happy to talk about any other aspect if you're curious. Now, in order to get a sense of the significance of this project, I think it's helpful to reflect upon its larger contributions. By focusing on the protracted process of gradual emancipation in Colombia, this study deepens our historical understanding of the experiential borderlands between slavery and freedom in the hemisphere. But more than that, the study fundamentally reframes the historiography of emancipation in Latin America and the Caribbean by inserting Colombia into the narrative. The foundational studies of gradual emancipation focus on what I call the first and third waves of gradual emancipation that unfolded in the late 18th century and the late 19th century, particularly in the northern United States for the first wave, and Cuba and Brazil for the third wave. But this project turns to the second wave of gradual emancipation in Latin America that occurred in between these two waves, that is, during the early 19th century, particularly in Spanish South America. As opposed to the first wave, the second wave of gradual emancipation in this region included all or nothing national propositions that sparked cataclysmic conflicts resulting in extensions of bondage and even war. The hemispheric impact of the second wave influenced the adoption of gradual emancipation in Cuba and Brazil, the most significant bastions of slavery in 19th century Latin America. Even more, a view from Colombia shifts our understanding of hemispheric abolitionism. From my research, I discovered that a diverse array of abolitionists across the Americas viewed Colombia as a model of emancipation in the 1820s and 30s. I'll be talking a little bit about this later on in my talk. And so Colombia was far from marginal in this larger sphere of larger public sphere of white abolitionism. But apart from this historiographical contribution, this project focuses on the little-known world of the majority Black Pacific lowlands of Colombia, a center of the Black Pacific world, a place that constantly escaped white governability. This is a story about a non-plantation rural gold mining economy that habitually sowed terror while also opening up unusual opportunities for freedom, thereby upending a neat dichotomy between urban and rural slavery. This is also a story about an extraordinary place, which is officially one of the rainiest places in the world, where there are literally hundreds of gold-rich rivers commanded by independent boatmen and Black women gold miners, plentiful rainforest cover to escape and commit disappearing acts, free Black and Indigenous villages managed by mayors of African and Indigenous descent. Today, it is home to Colombia's famous autonomous collective Black territories that witnessed some of the most horrific violence of the Civil War in the late 20th century, and despite the recent peace accords, continue to be plagued by paramilitary violence against Afro-Colombian land rights activists and social movements. Acts that I argue are reflective of not just the deep afterlife of slavery, but the afterlife of gradual emancipation in Colombia. Finally, this is but one story among many that comprise the Black Pacific world, an emerging paradigm in Latin American and African diasporic studies, referring to the formation of African-descended communities and subjectivities across the expansive Pacific. Situating the Pacific lowlands within this broader Black Pacific paradigm allows us to envision alternative histories and world making in a tradition similar to that of the Black Atlantic. So this project is not only about Colombia's role as a metaphorical frontier at the second wave of gradual emancipation in the Americas, but how these hemispheric dynamics were enforced and contested in an extraordinary frontier region. This then is a history of a remarkable place in terrifying times. Before we begin, however, I just want to give a content warning. Some of the topics and scenes we will be witnessing are difficult. So if you need to, for whatever reason, leave or step aside for however long, I completely understand. For now, let's turn to a remote village on the Colombian Black Pacific. Her name was Magdalena. We don't know how old she was when it happened, but we know that she was young, una joven, and that her master deemed it a, quote, moderate punishment, a corrective measure for an alleged infraction. And so her master dragged her to the patio, tied up her feet and hands, and placed an iron bar between her thighs, a torture technique universally employed and perfected by the horrifying perpetrators of Atlantic slavery. After repeated floggings, Magdalena was left alone overnight in the mildewed stocks, accompanied only by the steady rain, constellations of stars, and animals that roamed the village of Noanama, a remote indigenous settlement tucked away in the secluded rainforests of Colombia's tropical Pacific lowlands in the late 1840s. Perhaps one or more of the 5 witnesses who later testified to Magdalena's torture that evening tried to comfort her. Perhaps she was tended to by the indigenous woman whom the judge eventually dismissed because she did not know her own age. It is this endless perhaps and perhaps that collapse into my failure to tell what Saidiya Hartman calls, quote, an impossible story, to jeopardize the status of the event, to displace the received or authorized account, and to imagine what might have happened or might have been said or might have been done. By the morning, the damage was plainly visible. The young girl emerged from the stocks, quote, with her left hand permanently disabled, dislocated, and atrophied, bearing large scars. For many historians, Magdalena's story is a profoundly familiar one of brutal unfreedom, replete with musty stocks, iron bars, broken bones, and other unspoken punishments that elude the archival hold. Such scenes of torturous subjection form the bedrock of the archives of Atlantic world slavery. Yet, perhaps surprisingly for some, Magdalena's story is also one of violent freedom. Strictly speaking, Magdalena was not a slave. She was a child of the free womb, a new social subject established with the gradual emancipation law adopted in 1821 by slaveholding officials in the newly founded Republic of Gran Colombia, encompassing present-day Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Panama. This law, inspired by earlier gradual abolition laws in the late 18th and early 19th century Atlantic world, stipulated that all children born from enslaved women after the law's promulgation in 1821 were legally free but bonded to their mother's masters until the age of 18. Although Magdalena was ostensibly free, her peculiar condition as a captive within an evolving debt bondage economy in 19th century Colombia allowed her tormentor to believe that he could tear her apart without consequence. For thousands of young individuals like Magdalena, freedom under gradual emancipation produced disastrous consequences. Magdalena's life-negating experience captures the paradox as defined the making of the modern world in the greater Americas, how the rhetoric and politics of liberal freedom undergirded and extended policies of unfreedom. Freedom's Captives explores competing struggles over disparate modes of freedom and bondage in Colombia and the Colombian Pacific during the age of gradual emancipation. And I call the 31 years from the law's enactment in 1821 to the final abolition of slavery in 1852, the time of gradual emancipation rule in the Northern Andes. And I do so in order to see this period as a distinct moment in the history of liberal racial governance, rather than an inconsequential and benign prelude to the final abolition of slavery. The promissory freedom granted to the children of the free womb during gradual emancipation rule came to embody the quintessential paradox of liberal freedom in Colombia. These children were free yet captive, raceless yet Black. As my book contends, the liberal freedom generated through gradual emancipation rule came to constitute a modern mode of racial governance that birthed new forms of social domination while temporarily instituting de facto slavery. Although an end date was set for the eventual abolition of slavery, I argue that speculating slaveholders in Colombia paradoxically came to have an even greater stake in slavery through gradual emancipation rule. Culled from a diverse range of sources, including gold mining inventories, congressional debates, and last will and testaments, Freedom's Captives explores how gradual emancipation rule produced even cheaper bondspeople, expanded opportunities for diverse stakeholders to partake in the owning and exploitation of young Black people, and established new political rituals that reinforce the disciplining logic of the slaveholding order. My talk today will explore the making of and the calculating world made out of the free womb law, the central motor of a policy of gradual emancipation in the newly constructed Republic of Gran Colombia. Over the course of what would become the final tumultuous months of the Wars of Independence against Spain in the Northern Andes, representatives of Gran Colombia, many of whom were slaveholders, gathered together in the tropical savanna town of Cucuta, Colombia in 1821 to craft the future of the young nation, and consequently the future of young people like Magdalena. And here we can see the remains of the church where they met. Many of Colombia's earliest and most sweeping liberal reforms were passed in this historic Congress. Chattel slavery, one of the most contentious legacies of Spanish colonial rule, was also on the negotiating table. And to give you a sense of the scale of slavery in Gran Colombia at the time, in 1825, there were nearly 100,000 enslaved people out of a population of about 2.3 million, or about 4% of the population was enslaved. Now, for some scholars, this statistic may make slavery appear inconsequential in Colombia. In other words, using the long-established terminology of historians of slavery, Colombia on a national scale was technically a society with slaves rather than a slave society. And thereby, if we prioritize national demographics, Colombia may appear peripheral in this larger history of Atlantic world slavery. But this thinking, I believe, misses two important insights. First, on a more reductive level, Colombia certainly did have regional slave societies, such as the Pacific coastal lowlands, where most enslaved captives worked the gold mines during the colonial period, as opposed to the Caribbean coast of Colombia, which was a predominantly free Black society by the late 18th century. And second, privileging certain demographies can sometimes preclude scholars from imagining the vastly complex social, political, and racial functions of slavery. And here I'm thinking of Sherwin Bryant's work on slavery in colonial Ecuador or Wendy Warren's New England Bound. As a side note, moving forward in time, today, Colombia is actually the country with the third largest population of African descent in the Americas, that is after Brazil and the United States. But returning to the early 19th century Andean world, in response to the problem of slavery in Gran Colombia, the Republican Congress passed a gradual emancipation law in 1821. And at the center of this law was the law of the free womb, or La Ley de Libertad de Vientres. Designed to gradually abolish slavery through the wombs of enslaved women, the biopolitical project of the free womb law legislated that all children born to enslaved women would be declared legally free, but remain bonded to their mother's masters until the age of 18. Indeed, across the Atlantic world, the free womb law sought to gradually abolish the institution of slavery by destroying a legal doctrine that defined the very essence of chattel slavery, and that is partus sequitur ventrum, or the status of the child derives from the mother. The free womb law was thus, borrowing from Christina Sharp, one of the earliest, quote, afterlives of partus sequitur ventrum. Despite destroying the genealogical inheritability of chattel slavery, the free womb law created a new dimension in the Colombian debt bondage economy, resting on the technically free, yet practically unfree circulation of child and youth quasi-slaves. In short, the free womb law extended and reinscribed unfreedom through the rhetoric of freedom. Now, why was a free womb law passed in Colombia? So that you have a sense of the historical context, I want to briefly key in on three main dynamics that functioned on different geographic and political scales. First, national. The free womb law emerged in a broader political context of the breakdown of chattel slavery in the northern Andes, particularly in the latter years of the Wars of Independence against Spain. In the late 1810s, the leader of Gran Colombia, Simón Bolívar, who we can see depicted here, began to aggressively enlist and recruit enslaved men into the so-called patriot armies. As per Bolívar's orders, enslaved soldiers could acquire their freedom in exchange for a period of service. And so military service in the late 1810s set a critical precedent by tying the patriot cause with enslaved people's freedom in Colombia. In turn, the free womb law sought to compensate enslaved recruits for their loyalty to the patriot cause by ostensibly freeing their children. And we can certainly see how the free womb law was imagined as a kind of family policy here, where we see mother, child, and father. There were, of course, political economic dynamics at play as well. That is, the turn toward gradual rather than immediate emancipation was undoubtedly influenced by the fact that 80% of the post-war economy depended on gold mining. So from the perspective of the new Republican rulers, immediate abolition would collapse the economy. The second dynamic to understand why an emancipation law was adopted in Colombia is the Haitian Revolution and the specter of Haiti. In 1804, after 13 years of slave rebellion and war, the Black Republic of Haiti was established. And with the 1805 Constitution, Haiti abolishes chattel slavery, thereby becoming the first abolitionist republic in the Americas. In the aftermath of the Haitian Revolution, the Black specter of revolutionary Haiti became a crucial source of racial and political anxiety for the Colombian white elite. In fact, in making his case for emancipation, Simón Bolívar drew upon the specter of Haiti. At the Congress of Angostura in 1819, which formally established the Republic of Gran Colombia, Bolívar summoned the historic and dreaded examples of, quote, the helots of Spartacus and of Haiti that prove that one cannot be simultaneously free and enslaved, except by violating at one and the same time the natural law, the political laws, and the civil laws. Behind this backdrop of the Black specter of Haiti, Bolívar famously urged the Congress to confirm the, quote, freedom of the slaves, just as I would beg for my life and the life of the Republic. Lastly, another crucial dynamic was the Atlantic world dimension. Colombia was not the first government in the Americas to pursue a policy of gradual abolition through a free birth law. Nearly 50 years of gradual emancipation legislation in the revolutionary Atlantic world preceded Colombia's law in 1821. Although the Kingdom of Portugal was actually the first governing body in the Atlantic world to pass a gradual abolition law in 1773, Anglophone North America, especially the Northeast, was the site of the first significant wave of gradual emancipation legislation. Revolutionary ideas of political independence, the powerful anti-slavery protests of the Quakers, and relatively smaller enslaved populations as compared to the US South resulted in the adoption of a gradualist approach to the problem of Northern slavery. In 1780, the state of Pennsylvania was the first political body in North America to institute a policy of gradual abolition, which became the blueprint for free birth legislation across the Atlantic world. In the years that followed, other northern states implemented similar gradual abolition measures, including Connecticut and Rhode Island in 1784, New York in 1799, and New Jersey in 1804, each with different periods of bondage. We'll be talking about that a little later. Upper Canada also adopted the Act Against Slavery in 1793, which instituted a free birth policy in British North America. While the first wave of gradual abolition ended in North America in 1804, the second wave picked up in revolutionary South America a few years later under a different constellation of political forces. In 1808, for those of you not familiar with the history, Napoleon's forces invaded and occupied the Iberian Peninsula amidst the collapse of the Spanish monarchy. Consequently, a tidal wave of political crises hit Spain and eventually its American colonies. After news of the crisis crossed the Atlantic, juntas or councils led largely by Creoles or American-born Spaniards formed across Spanish America that professed their loyalty to the crown and later complete autonomy that would later evolve into the wars of independence against Spain. In Chile, the first free womb law was passed in Spanish America in 1811. Building off of gradual abolition precedents in North America, the Chilean law unconditionally freed all the future children of enslaved women born after its promulgation. Chile was then followed by Argentina, which declared a free womb law in 1813 under similar circumstances with the early wars of independence. 8 years later, the Republic of Gran Colombia passed a free womb law in 1821. Peru passed such a law in 1821 as well. Uruguay in 1825, Bolivia in 1831, and Paraguay in 1842. Then we have a last wave of gradual emancipation laws with Puerto Rico and Cuba in 1870, and then Brazil in 1871. And here's a table that I've designed categorizing these three waves of free birth / free womb laws in the Atlantic world. The first wave mostly occurring in North America, as we talked about, second wave in South America, and this third wave in Imperial Brazil and the remaining colonies in Portuguese Africa and the Spanish Caribbean. I should mention that I did not include the British Caribbean colonies here because emancipation was not legislated through a free womb law there, but through an apprenticeship law, which was a distinct legal process. That'll be coming up a little bit more later. And here we can see in another table that I've designed that different countries and states across the Atlantic world adopted different ages of emancipation. Colombia is highlighted with an age of emancipation of 18, but we can see how New Jersey, for example, passed a gradual emancipation law in 1804 and designated free womb emancipation according to sex. Other polities like Rhode Island, Peru, and Paraguay did as well. And here I want to briefly gesture towards a digital humanities project that I have designed titled the Free Womb Project, which you can check out on the website listed there. And this project is a multilingual digital collection of gradual emancipation laws with free womb clauses that I have had translated, and I translated myself from different governments across the Atlantic world during the late 18th and 19th centuries. And here you can see the various countries and states included. So these legal precedents in the revolutionary Atlantic profoundly influenced Colombian statesmen such as José Félix de Restrepo, who was the creator of the gradual emancipation law in Colombia. In his opening speech to the Congress in 1821, the title page of that speech was published the following year, and we can see that here. Restrepo referred to the examples of Pennsylvania that, quote, abolished slavery and is one of the most thriving states in North America, in addition to, quote, Chile and Buenos Aires that have declared the freedom of the womb. But the political gaze was not simply unidirectional. In the words of Marcela Echeverri, in this case, north-south-north, that is Colombians looking to North America, or south-south, Colombians looking toward Chile or Argentina. Interestingly, unbeknownst to scholars of Atlantic anti-slavery, abolitionist politicians from England to the United States actually viewed Colombia as a model of abolition during the 1820s and 30s. In 1824, for example, a few months after a massive slave rebellion, the Marquis of Lansdowne petitions the British House of Lords to pass an abolitionist measures, pointing out how, quote, the state of Colombia had made provisions for the gradual extinction of slavery. Care had been taken in Colombia to secure to all parties compensation for loss, and the manumission of slaves had been attended with considerable immediate advantages to the masters themselves. Later that month, Earl Grosvenor of Westminster declared that he, quote, wished some measure to be adopted to obviate this, referring to slavery in the British colonies, a measure something like that which has been agreed to in Colombia. There are several other examples from the British. Meanwhile, in 1836, the famed New England abolitionist Lydia Maria Child published The Evils of Slavery, where she cited the abolitionist measure of the Congress of Colombia among a list of other exemplary emancipatory legislations. So at the Congress of Cucuta in 1821, Colombian representatives not only transformed the institution of chattel slavery in the Northern Andes, they also formulated a blueprint for fellow white abolitionists in the Atlantic world. So broadly, we can see that the Colombian Emancipation Law emerged out of the context of the Wars of Independence, the Haitian Revolution, and Atlantic world gradual abolitionism. For the remainder of my talk, I'm going to focus on the new social subject that was created by the Colombian Free Womb Law, and that is the free womb captive. The Free Womb Law was riddled with paradoxes that lay at the heart of early 19th century racial liberalism. The law declared that free womb children were born free, but in reality fixed a term limit on their legalized captivity. Moreover, the free womb child was not explicitly considered a slave, but like a slave could be bought and sold on the marketplace. The Free Womb Law codified these children's circulation in the economy of slavery and made it easier for slaveholders to procure ostensibly freeborn captives. Thus, while slaveholders, particularly in Western Colombia, a historic stronghold of slavery, vehemently derided the law as theft, some of them nevertheless saw the Free Womb Law as a real economic opportunity to cash in on especially cheap pools of unfree labor. As one slaveholder in the 1840s recounted, quote, a 7-year-old slave would cost 150 to 200 pesos. Who doesn't know that a free womb child of such an age could only be sold for 60 pesos? One official even developed an informal system of categorizing the sale price of free womb children, asserting that, quote, the median price of the children younger than 7 years old is 30 pesos, those between 7 and 14, 40 pesos, and those who exceed this age up to 18 years old, 50 pesos. I should also note that elsewhere in Latin America, formal systems categorizing the sale price of free womb children were established, as in Uruguay in 1838, which we can see here in this table, regulating the price of free womb children in the Uruguayan market. So we'll see los de un año, 30 pesos, los de dos, 40 pesos, los de tres, 45 pesos, and so forth. Yet, more than just economic opportunity, the Free Womb Law influenced the economic management culture of slaveholders in Colombia. We can get a sense of this by comparing mining inventories from the Pacific lowlands executed before and after the 1821 law. Prior to the law, lowland slaveholders exhibited only a general sense of how an enslaved person's age affected their value. This is evident in the informal language used to describe the different ages of enslaved gold miners. So this is a page from an inventory from 1810. This is the early independence period, and it's a female slaveholder's inventory. Her name was Nicolasa Becerra. I actually found a map of her gold mine when I was in the archives. You can see at the bottom left, it says Real de Minas de Doña Nicolasa Becerra. In any case, we can see an economic culture of informality by the language used to describe the ages of several different enslaved gold miners. So first we have a man named Jose Cartagena de 24 años, Jose Cartagena, who is 24 years old. Next we have Francisco de 35 años, poco más o menos. Francisco, who is more or less 35 years old. And then lastly, we have Juan como de 14 años, Juan, who is about 14 years old. So here we have three different levels of linguistic precision when it comes to age. That is, more or less, or about. And this is all prior to the law. Now, after the free womb law was adopted in 1821, lowland gold mines became markedly more precise in recording ages, particularly with regard to free womb children. This change is evident in the 1832 inventory of the Raspadura gold mine, for example, whose rivers were worked by 160 enslaved people and 120 free womb captives. While the language utilized to describe the enslaved people's ages remained informal, records specified the age of free womb captives down to the year, month, and day, años, meses, y días. For example, the free womb girl Maria Vicenta was listed as being 4 years, 1 month, and 8 days old. So in this sense, the free womb law intersected with emerging modern business practices that emphasize planning on the micro and macro levels, as well as greater precision of, quote, asset management, features of a capitalist culture that would expand in Colombia in the 1840s. And we can get a sense of this expansion of capitalist practices in Colombia during this period by examining the rise of, for example, savings banks in the mid to late 1840s, which enslaved peoples participated in. Now, this is a fascinating document. It's a summary of deposits in the Caja de Oros, which is Spanish for savings bank. The first one was established in the capital of Bogota in 1846. This record is from the Colombian Pacific from the month of March 1848. And on the right, you'll see how the depositors are classified. It includes 2 esclavos, 2 slaves who deposited 77 pesos. And this is also fascinating because summaries like this were published in the national newspaper, La Gaceta Oficial, so they were circulating among the reading public. We can also see the expansion of capitalist practices through the passing of new ordinances, such as this one from the late 1840s that obliged free womb captives who worked in domestic service to sign official contracts with their masters. And these sources are among the seeds of a future project I will be pursuing, examining slavery's capitalism in the anti-slavery republics of South America. Nevertheless, returning to this document, we can see how the free womb law forced slaveholders to focus more precisely on their day-to-day details of their enterprises. This more intense calculation of the years, months, and days ticking by also forced slaveholders to imagine an eventual post-slavery order. And I argue that this awareness of time and impending emancipation also affected the terminology used to discuss free womb children. And I do so through a careful analysis of the changing lexicon of free womb children in the notarial archives. So this includes records like notes of sale, last will and testaments, and debt payments. I found that from the 1820s to the late 1830s, the free womb child's status was described in particular ways that marked their special legal condition, including under the law of manumission, free by the law of manumission, or of the free womb. And we can see an example of this here, un hijo libre por la ley. But beginning in the late 1830s and increasingly during the 1840s, the children were referred to as manumitidos or manumisos, translating into manumitted slaves, terms dating from the colonial period. You can see an example of that here. That these far older terms of manumitido or manumiso replaced references to the free womb law as a shorthand for the status of these children signals an attempt to gradually ally these children's special legal status, thereby entrenching slavery's hold under gradual emancipation rule. Alternatively, the term might have signaled the ways in which the free womb children were increasingly considered manumitted subjects of the emerging Colombian state. Thus, not only was the free womb law a way of reinscribing unfreedom through the rhetoric of freedom, but it was also seized upon by slaveholders as an opportunity for cheap labor and inadvertently bureaucratic modernization. But the Colombian free womb law was borrowing from Barbara Fields, not a quote, fixed condition, but a constantly moving target. In the early 1840s, gradual emancipation rule was reconfigured when Colombian slaveholders changed the age of bondage. After July 1839, an entire generation of children born from enslaved mothers after 1821 were scheduled to turn 18, therefore allowing them to pursue a life of full freedom beyond their master's reach. And this phrase, full freedom or plena libertad, was used by the kin of free womb children in the archive. However, Colombia's first civil war, the War of the Supremes, beginning in 1839, would modify that timeline. Very briefly, the slaveholding classes of Colombia feared this war because many captives and free Black people joined the rebel forces. And we can see this in this ominous racialization of the soldiers and this artistic rendition of the rebels at the time. Amid the Civil War, political pressure to modify the free womb law began to build. Finally passed in May 1842, in the aftermath of the war, a mandatory apprenticeship program was adopted called concertaje, whereby the children of the free womb would be forced to work under a suitable master until the age of 25. So from 18 to 25 years of bondage, meaning 7 more years of forced labor. And if we know that the average life expectancy of a Colombian at the time was about 25 years of age, we can see how the apprenticeship program was essentially a life sentence. Colombian authorities no doubt found legal inspiration for the system of free womb concertaje in the various modifications to free womb laws adopted by fellow Andean republics in the 1830s and early 1840s. For example, after leaving Colombia, Gran Colombia in 1830, the newly independent Republic of Venezuela immediately reformed their free womb law by extending the age of bondage to 21. In 1840, Venezuelan authorities changed their free womb law yet again to force children to serve their mother's masters as apprentices until the age of 25, the age eventually adopted by the Colombian Congress. In late 1839, Peru changed its own free womb law, also promulgated in 1821, to an even more repressive degree, extending the age of bondage to 50. Moreover, in adopting concertaje, Colombian officials were inspired especially by the British and their apprenticeship model in the West Indies. In April 1842, Colombian diplomatic officials in London and Kingston began to formally request the British government's acts, decrees, and regulations pertaining to emancipation. So here we can see how the British example helped shape the Colombian Congress's adoption of apprenticeship. And this larger history shows the many directional gazes of 19th century Atlantic anti-slavery. 10 years after this new law, amid a liberal revolution in Colombia, Congress abolished slavery in January 1852. And the Colombian government passed final abolition with compensation to former slaveholders. So here is a compensation record for a former slaveholder from Buenaventura on the Pacific coast for 6 enslaved people he held. And while I'm here, I want to briefly gesture to another digital project I hope to pursue, which will digitize compensation records stored at the National Archives in Bogota, Colombia. You can see an example of it here. I'm happy to talk about these records. This project was very much inspired by the legacies of British slave ownership project created with you at UCL. And I hope to pursue this project in partnership with the archive and colleagues at 2 universities there, in addition to Afro-Colombian social movement leaders. Yet, despite final abolition, gradual emancipation rule remained insofar as many children of the free womb continued under the tutelage of their mother's master. Various officials like the governor of Popayán in southwestern Colombia argue that the final abolition law did not include the children of the free womb. The free womb captives thus remained in juridical limbo until April 1852, when Congress passed a law legally emancipating them. And among the thousands of emancipated free womb captives across Colombia was Magdalena. What ran through her mind, knowing her tormentor no longer had legal dominion over her, eludes us. Perhaps joining her mother, sister, or cousin, Magdalena would build a new world for herself that violated the wildest dreams of her captors. Yet the violence of gradual emancipation rule had been done. Magdalena would never have her whole, unbroken body back, and undoubtedly so much more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yesenia. That was fascinating. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions, and I'm really excited to hear about the digitization project as well. We'll move over to hear Bethan's response, but before we do that, I just would like to say, if you're thinking of a question that you would like to ask after we've heard the response from Dr. Bethan Fisk, then either raise your hand using the raise hand function on Zoom, or you can type it into the chat. That's fine as well, and I can relay that to our speakers. So over to you, Bethan.
Thank you. So firstly, thank you so much, Yesenia, for your wonderful talk. Thank you to Bill and everyone at the seminar for the invitation. It's a delight to continue to be in dialogue with Yesenia and her work. So Yesenia, I'll be brief, as I'm sure what you've shared today will generate loads of questions from the audience. So I'm just going to summarize what I feel the some of the major contributions of your book and ask two broad questions. So feel free to answer those now or later, as I'm sure they may connect to other questions that come up. Today's talk and the monograph make clear the centrality of gradual emancipation rule in Colombia. Yesenia's concept of gradual emancipation rule showcases the importance of a period so often forgotten as a period so often forgotten. It's represented as one of slavery's decline or of liberal freedom's progress as a footnote. So it really invites us to think beyond typical chronologies of Black unfreedom in the Americas. Rather than the decline, Barragan shows us how gradual emancipation rule was a period of transformation in which new Republican and liberal technologies of Black unfreedom emerged, and how that process was gendered. And crucial here is the study of free womb children, which really highlights the need for more work on the infants and young people caught in this legal category in Colombia and beyond, and more generally, the experiences of enslaved children in Latin America. Yesenia makes clear the importance of gradual emancipation rule in Colombia, and as she showed for us so well today, its applicability across the Americas. And so this legislation was constructed as part of these three waves. It was the second of these waves, and made in conversation with sites across the Atlantic world. I wondered if you could speak further to us about the wider implications of gradual emancipation rule in the Americas for how we periodize histories of slavery and freedom. Secondly, Freedom's Captives is just such a beautiful book. It's so attentive to the natural and built environment and particularities of place in Chocó. And much of the book is really interdisciplinary, and it pays incredible attention to detail through imaginative narration, and it does incredible things with the archive that I'm sure all of you will get a lot out of. While deepening understanding of Chocó's racialized and marginalized location in the Colombian national imaginary as a frontier, you also make clear that it was a central place, not only of capital accumulation, but also for the production of ideas about and experiences of freedom and unfreedom. So it's such an important contribution in redirecting our attention to the Colombian Black Pacific, and really is one of the first, I suppose, the first historiographical work of history to really theorize the Colombian Black Pacific. And so I wondered, and this is, I suppose, a question that I'm really interested in, so I'm really excited to hear your response on this, but why do you think that the Black Pacific has received far less attention in Colombian historiography relative to the work in anthropology? And I think what's really useful about this question is, besides from my personal interest, I think this really underscores the significance of your work to the wider audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Bethan. Do you want to come back directly on some of those points, Yesenia?
Yeah, I think it'd be great if I can just quickly talk about or respond to Bethan's really amazing, thank you so much, feedback and questions. Well, first, regarding the wider implications of gradual emancipation in the Americas and my work in reorienting slavery, I found it to be a useful exercise to, well, first, as you pointed out, gradual emancipation in Colombia has been largely treated, as you said, as a footnote, a historiographical footnote, and to the more, dynamic period following the abolition of slavery, the final abolition of slavery in 1852. But what I wanted to do, through this idea of gradual emancipation rule was really to highlight this period as, an incredibly important, significant period in the lives, everyday lives of enslaved peoples and the people and their children, right, who were born during this period. But, what sort of an interesting kind of, what's the word? What I started to sort of think through was that, let's try to isolate certain years. So in 1842, for example, we have the passage of this law that I talked about earlier in my presentation that extends bondage from 18 to 25 years old for free womb children. We also have this law that opens up the slave trade to the South. With the 1821 law, the slave trade was made illegal, but then in 1842, the slave trade is opened up. And so we see this kind of, in sort of, colloquial terms, this kind of repressive period starting up where slavery is becoming more and more entrenched in Colombian society. But if we look at, for example, 1842 in other regions like Cuba, I'm thinking of Alejandro de la Fuentes' work and how there was the process of, oh gosh, help me here, Bethan, in 1842, there was a process of self-purchase that became legalized in Cuba. And so there was openings for enslaved peoples to purchase their freedom and creation of more kind of free people of color communities. And so there's, it kind of reorients how we understand these anti-slavery republics if we isolate this period of 1842 and sort of see how slavery was being expanded and, expanded in Colombia and the Andean region versus, Cuba, where slavery is being ameliorated in this particular way. So I wanted to kind of, I talk a little bit about that in my book too. So why the Black Pacific has received less attention? That's such a good question. So there's great anthropological work on this. Obviously there's Arturo Escobar, there's Kieran Asher. I'm thinking of mostly the English language ones right now. A few Uslander as well. It's a good question.
Nina Friedman.
Yeah, Nina Friedman. Exactly. I think part of it is the sources. So for my book, I depended heavily on notarial sources. So I'm talking about notes of purchase, last will and testaments. Let's see, debt payments and so forth. And my work, in addition to, historians like Sergio Mosquera, who is someone that I deeply admire and has written a lot about Choco and this period as well. Most historians have kind of evaded, I think, notarial records in the Pacific Coast. And so a lot of my my work really relies on these notarial records. I don't know, but I think, it's a hard question. I think that, the dynamic social movements from the Black Pacific has really brought attention to anthropologists. And there's this, I want to say, kind of idea that, that the Black Pacific is largely a region where slavery and gold mining happened, not necessarily where lives were lived. And so that was the goal of my book, to kind of really excavate these everyday lives of people as they panned the river for gold, as they fought for the freedom of their, free womb children and so forth. There's a lot to say there, but I'll have to sit with it some more. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for answering those points, and thank you very much for your comments to Bethan. We have one hand up so far. Anyone else who wants to ask a question, get those hands up or put them in the chat, but I'll go over now to Laura. If you'd like to unmute and ask your question, please.
Hi, Yesenia. So
Hi,
nice to see you
Laura.
and to finally hear about the project. I can't wait to read the book. And hi, Bethan. I have a question. I mean, the work is so beautiful, and I can't wait to be able to engage with it in my work. As a 20th century person, what strikes me as a very significant contribution is to, I think there's this narrative that after the end of slavery ceased to be, and race and anti-Blackness ceased to be this kind of significant for the construction of the central state, especially for the construction of liberalism. So as a political project, which is so dominant in Colombia, and especially again in the 1930s after the end of the conservative hegemony. So I'm curious about if you have any thoughts about kind of the implications of your work for rethinking these very problematic deracialized ideas that are at the center of kind of Colombian liberalism and the actual founding of the nation state.
Yeah.
And thank you.
It's a fabulous question, and it's one that I wrestled with, especially if you read the what is it? The last, hold on, I'm going to just pull up my book. The epilogue of my book. I talk about what I describe as the afterlife of gradual emancipation, and that is very much borrowing from Saidiya Hartman's idea of the afterlife of slavery, where she talks about reduced life expectancies, prison sentences, poverty, et cetera. She's looking specifically at the northern United States, but similar things can be said for Afro-Colombian people in the contemporary moment. But what I mean by gradual emancipation, the afterlife of gradual emancipation, is this idea of progress, so-called progress amid continuing racial terror. So that was what gradual emancipation was, this idea that freedom was achieved, that progress was made, albeit under a system of deep, terrifying captivity, right? So that's how I would answer your question, that we can think of this period as a kind of very foundational period for setting up this idea of kind of deracialized progress that really, I think, becomes magnified, especially, thinking about I think it was the 1886 Constitution that, officially writes out Afro-descended peoples from existence, right? And then, just thinking about the current social movements that have, thinking specifically about the late 80s and early 90s Afro-Colombian social movements that really force liberal and progressive Colombian authorities and Colombians to think about the deeply racist foundations of Colombian history. And so I would definitely point you towards the epilogue of my book if you want to think about the larger repercussions of this period for the contemporary moment.
Thank you.
Thanks.
You.
All right. Does anybody else have a question? I'll get in with chair's privilege and ask one first, and then I'll come to Gad Herman, if that's all right. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about this proposed digitization project. It sounds very exciting, and what you think might be some of the particular benefits of looking at those Colombian records in that context.
Yeah, the records are located at the Archivo General de la Nación in Bogotá, Colombia. And they're all under this, mostly under this folder file called Manumission, Manumission, which I think is an interesting historical category to place these compensation files, but that's another story. And so, my book is one of the first books to really look into the politics of compensation in Colombia. And so I dug through, all these different compensation records, particularly from the Colombian Pacific, to see how it was that I described these paper bodies of formerly enslaved peoples were rolling and continue to bankroll the economy of the region after the abolition of slavery in 1852. But all that to say that, it's largely organized. Most of them, like I said, are in this file called the Manumission, and the idea or the hope of the project is to digitize them and make them accessible to researchers to have a serious conversation about the afterlife of slavery, in Colombia, and to think through, the deeply, like I was thinking about Laura's comment, the deeply racist history of Colombia and this lack of discussion of how the foundation of the country rests on these histories of slavery, and how these elite families were paid for enslaved people's emancipation. It's in the very early stages. I need to still talk to archivists. I don't know what the politics of I can imagine what the politics might be of digitizing and making these sources public, but the idea is to have this kind of very, important and public conversation about reparations as well in the country. I think Alejandra has a question, but I'm not sure if we want to.
Yeah, I'll go to Gad, because I've had a hand up for a little while, and then I'll come back to the ones in the chat if that's all right. So over to you, Gad.
Okay, Yesenia, hello. Nice to see you visually, at least in this particular form, rather just in writing. Anyway, thank you very much for your paper. Really interesting, and I was particularly interested in your discussion of the apprenticeship system, the apprenticeship period in the British West Indies, something which particularly interests me. And I was curious if you could expand on how it was seen to be a model for developments in Colombia.
Yeah, I don't have much to say just because I didn't look entirely that much deeply into the British beyond seeing how the Colombian government was requesting specific, materials from the British government in Jamaica, based in Jamaica at the time. But I did highlight that because I wanted to show how the Colombians were looking towards the British for examples for developing their own apprenticeship models, like I said in the presentation, but also how in the earlier period, in the 1820s and 30s, how the British were looking towards Colombia as a model of emancipation. So it's this very, intricate, very dynamic conversation happening throughout the Atlantic world in this period. What's funny is that I had a colleague of mine who works on the UK, works in the UK, based out of California. She made this funny comment. She's like, why are the Colombians looking towards the British apprenticeship model as this model when it was a total failure? Thinking about Thomas Holt's work here. And I said, this is 1842. It wasn't until the 1850s that, the British themselves really began to see this apprenticeship model and post-abolition society in general as a kind of disaster. And so, we have to think about the specific, years and periods that these contemporaries are, viewing the world through. I hope that answers some of your question. But, yeah.
It's very interesting. It's quite complicated, this whole question of failure, not failure. But I will leave. That's a whole separate issue. But very, very interesting to hear you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gad. So there's two questions in the chat. The first one is from Yechi, which is, have you found any connections with Asian slavery in your work?
Asian slavery. So unfortunately, I have not, but I would definitely direct you to my colleague Tatiana Sejas's work, who examines basically that question of Asian slavery, but looking specifically in Mexico. I will say one interesting thing, just thinking about the question of Asia, and this refers back to, I think, Bethan's comment about the Black Pacific. There's this idea that the Black Pacific is largely kind of this remote backwater where nothing really happens except slavery and gold mining. But what was interesting is that I found, I was looking through last will and testaments, that there, specifically of female slaveholders who owned gold mines and plantations and so forth, that, going through their inventories of clothing, they had a lot of clothes from China and from the Asiatic world. So, just thinking about kind of the circulation of certain items that were were passing through the economy at that time. It's not at all responding to your question, but just trying to make a little bit of a connection there.
Thanks. And then the other question we have in the chat is from Alejandra, who says, just to follow up with Laura's question, could you please give more detail on the compensation policy of the 1850s and of its political context? How is it debated or sanctioned or implemented, and how is it paid?
How is it paid for? Yeah, that's a really, really big question, and I would gesture you towards the last chapter of my book, where I really get into in more detail, basically answer your question, Alejandra. But in short, it was, this is interesting. I have this idea or this hope of writing a journal article called The Compensation Consensus, how basically after, in the 1850s, we see this wave of abolitionist governments, thinking about Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, Argentina, and so forth, passing final abolition with emancipation to former slaveholders. So it's this kind of larger Atlantic world process that's happening as well. So how did exactly it happen in Colombia? Well, it was largely a contentious one. It was debated hotly in the Congress. I get into those specific debates in my book. And what happens is basically, and there are different kind of proposals. So one proposal was to compensate slaveholders, instead of paying them with land that was unoccupied. That didn't go through. And so what happens in the end is that there's this first class and second class manumission bills. First class bills were granted to slaveholders who manumitted their slaves or were forced to manumit their slaves on a certain day, and then the second class bills were granted to former slaveholders who manumitted their slaves on the final day of the abolition of slavery, which was on January 1st, 1852. And so there's this whole kind of hierarchy of bills that forms in this period. I talk about that process in my book. How it actually happened is really hard to fully understand. It's interesting. There's this really important book called El Camino de Libertad, written by these economists, and they argue that because there was no uproar or rebellion, that we can see this as proof that compensation was actually granted to former slaveholders after the abolition of slavery in 1852. But in my book, I also talk about how these former slaveholders, use their compensation bills to pay for certain debts, to give as inheritances to their children. And so as I talked about earlier, it's important to think through these compensation bills as kind of this very, important afterlife of slavery, specifically the afterlife of slavery, how it affected former slaveholders and their families, and continued to bankroll the economy after 1852.
Thanks. Another question from Matthew Brown. Matthew.
Hi, Yesenia. That was super. I really enjoyed it. I can't wait to read the book. It's a big question. Maybe you can't answer it, but I was just thinking, have you got any sense about whether enslaved women had fewer children or more children after the passing of free womb laws, and what kind of effect it had on general attitudes towards reproduction within enslaved communities? Or maybe no idea, but I'm just interested.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. I am a huge fan of your work, so it's really nice to see you here. Whether enslaved women had fewer or more children, it's really hard to say without having done the deep before and after demographic analysis, right? What I will say, and this doesn't really answer your question, is that one way of freeing the free womb children was by purchasing their debt their freedom from their masters. And so, why did I bring that up? What's interesting is that you have mothers in the archive who are purchasing the freedom of their children and calling it full freedom. And so I talk about this a little in my presentation and talk about this in my book, is how these mothers really understood the free womb captivity as this partial freedom, sort of, liminal space, and understood the purchase of freedom as this idea of full freedom. It doesn't at all answer your question, but I'm just thinking specifically of what kind of perspectives we can be granted by these mothers. Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't answer your question, but it's an interesting one. I'm just thinking through the various sources that I examined. I examined a lot of like death certificates. And so I didn't notice any changes in terms of the deaths of free womb children versus enslaved children before the abolition law was passed in 1821. So I can't really say much about that either, but thank you.
Thanks. And I think Alejandro's got a follow-up question, if you'd like to ask that, Alejandro.
Thank you. Thank you, Yesenia. It's I can't really wait to read more and read the book. I haven't seen it yet. I have two sort of two questions. One that is somehow a follow-up of my former of your answer, and it seems kind of interesting that both the timing of this gradual emancipation and for the compensation policies, in the 50s and so on, they seem to be similar across Latin America, despite different use of African labor or these former slaves' labor in those parts. Seems to be something, going above all that. That doesn't seem to be specific of the particular situation. That's one question. And the other one, I'd like to know a little bit more about the details of the apprenticeship, that how they were conceived, or even though if they were trying to replicate the British one, I would imagine that, the setting for the apprentice were very different. So how was design, or how was the envision at the time?
So I'll answer definitely your second. Thank you so much for those questions. I really appreciate it. In terms of apprenticeship, so the specific system was called concertaje. And what's really interesting about concertaje is that this was the term used in the early colonial period to refer to indigenous people who were essentially enslaved peoples on plantations, but were being paid for their services. And so it's this interesting kind of use of this indigenous servitude language that's being applied to adult free womb peoples, in the 1840s. So what was it specifically? I talk a lot about it in the fourth chapter of my book, which focuses on the free womb children, and then has a section that focuses on apprenticeship. But essentially, there were debates about whether or not the children, and it always feels strange because they're adults, these people, these free womb captives, could apprentice themselves to a specific person, or if they had to be assigned to a specific person. There was complaints by local jefes to make it so that the masters had control over their apprenticeship until the age of 25. What's also interesting about this apprenticeship is that even though it was passed in 1842, what I found when I was looking at lawsuits, freedom suits, is that it was rarely utilized or referred to in the lawsuits. So the lawsuits after 1842 usually refer to only 18 years of service and not 25. And so that was an interesting kind of finding, that the 1821 law was the law of the land, and the 1842 law was hard to implement at least thinking through the freedom suits that I analyzed for this book. Regarding your first question, I'm not sure if you could if you could say it again.
No, just you had in the presentation this chart about somehow the chronology for the subsequent legislation, and it's interesting because the steps and the timing of these decisions is very much the same. You had the map with the little arrows. It's very much the same in different parts of Latin America, that they had a very different, if you want, use of slave labor. Okay.
Right.
And then when I ask you about the compensation, you mentioned that in other countries as well, about the same time, there is this drive to somehow settle whatever are the claims. It would be interesting to know more about that, and I promise I'm gonna get the book. So what is that? The same similar kind of coincidence in the timing happens when the sort of elite or former slave owners or whatever manage to get their claims recognized and settled by the state, presumably, and they're all about the same time too. Again, when presumably the effect or the prejudices of having lost the slaves should have been very different, in Colombia than in Montevideo or Chile. That was a sort of a coincidence that caught my attention.
Yeah, and that's a great point to make. And it's one that I don't have an answer to, but I certainly would like to explore more in that article that I'm hoping to write about this compensation consensus. You're right that these different countries have different regimes of slavery, right? And they have different significance, right? Thinking about slavery in urban, Buenos Aires versus the gold mines of Colombia and so forth. But I think what I want to point to is that there's this Atlantic world process happening of compensation, of abolition with compensation to slaveholders. I'm not sure exactly why that's the case, but it's something that's happening. It's a phenomenon that's happening, and we need to figure out why.
I will go back to Laura's question. I think that there is something about this sort of liberal constitutionalism, overall and widespread, and they are all. I mean, they are managing to get the state to settle this claim. So, well, it's a different way to look at that. But anyway, thank you. It's very, very interesting. I'm looking forward to that.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate your questions.
We're almost at the end. There is, I think, a time for a final question from Tom Rath.
Yeah, it's very generous of you to call me. Really fascinating paper. I've got a bunch of questions, and I can ask you a bit later from a lot of these. But I suppose the one I had, just to follow us up what we were talking about, is the state settles these claims in the 1850s. Does it go into debt to settle those claims like the British government does? Does Colombia have access to financial markets to the bag? Where does the and is it a very large amount of money? Do you have a sense of the,
Yeah, I don't have the exact numbers, but I talk about this in the last chapter of my book. As I say on page 252, what coincidence? These two economic historians claim that the Colombian treasury invested nearly 2.5 million pesos in compensating former slaveholders. And this was no small investment because the national budget in 1845 was 2.8 million pesos. So yes, in short, the answer to your question is it must have gone into debt to pay for compensation.
I suppose. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I mean, I just wondered in terms of trying to explain what's going on in the early 1850s, politically, economically. I mean, there may be that there are banks willing to lend the money to do this in that period. That might be an additional variable, but
yeah, I'm not entirely sure. My research didn't get too deeply into the kind of national economic politics of compensation, but it's certainly a good one, and I hope to pursue it when I write this future article.
Great.
Okay, I think we are going to have to draw to a close there. I'd like to thank all of you for coming. I'd like to thank our discussant, Dr. Bethan Fisk, for some really excellent comments. And above all, I'd like to thank our speaker today, Dr. Yesenia Barragan, for presenting on a really exciting and important book. And for those of you who haven't read it yet, I think there's a lot of anticipation to go out and do so amongst the audience today. So if people would like to unmute their microphones and thank Yesenia in the traditional fashion, that would be great.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.